Ready to go? Good morning. The committee will come to order. We meet today to consider H.R. 452, the Medicare Decisions Accountability Act. This legislation repeals the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which was a program included in the Democrats' health care law. The most unifying feature of the IPAB is the strong bipartisan support for its repeal. Speaking in support of its repeal, Congressman Frank Pallone, ranking member of the Health Subcommittee at Energy and Commerce, stated, and I'm quoting, I'm opposed to an independent commission playing a legislative role other than on a recommendatory basis. It's not the job of an independent commission to make decisions on health care policy for Medicare beneficiaries, end quote. This committee's own ranking member of the Subcommittee on Health, Congressman Pete Stark, has described IPAB as a mindless rate-cutting machine that sets Medicare up for unsustainable cuts that will endanger the health of America's seniors and people with disabilities. As of today, the legislation to repeal IPAB is co-sponsored by a bipartisan group of 234 members. Since its inception, IPAB has been the focus of continued and vocal opposition from across the healthcare community because it threatens to reduce beneficiaries' access to treatments and services in Medicare. Given the widespread concerns about the impact that IPAB will have on their ability to provide quality healthcare services and treatment, it's no wonder that Easter Seals, the Alliance of Specialty Medicine, the Veterans Health Council, and the 60+ Association, groups representing consumers, physicians, manufacturers, small businesses, large employers, insurers, brokers, and agents in all 50 states support the repeal of the IPAB. Although members of Congress and the healthcare community have registered their concerns about IPAB and support its repeal, it's the general public who remain the most vocal about ending this program before it begins. According to a recent public opinion poll, the idea of IPAB remains deeply unpopular. 73% expressed concern that Medicare cuts recommended by IPAB could go into effect without congressional approval, even if IPAB's recommendations overturn a law previously passed by Congress. 71% expressed concern that changes made to Medicare based on IPAB's recommendations can't be challenged in a court. And 67% worry that IPAB could choose to limit which specific health services are covered by Medicare. The American people have every cause for concern. The vast and unchecked powers of IPAB go far beyond what I believe many of us ever imagined. Simply put, IPAB is a dangerous new government agency made up of unelected bureaucrats with no oversight, no accountability, and no recourse for seniors to appeal any of IPAB's decisions. Regardless of political affiliation, I believe that we all share a similar perspective about Medicare and the role that Congress plays in the future of the program. Our colleague, Senator John Cornyn, said it well. America's seniors deserve the ability to hold elected officials accountable for the decisions that affect Medicare. I couldn't agree more. Many Americans do not support the new health care law because they believe it to be a power grab by Washington. When decisions are made behind closed doors in secret by 15 unelected bureaucrats, as is the case with IPAB, then the American people's worst fears are confirmed. And it proves why America remains worried that even more of the same is coming out of Washington. There is a better way. If we can agree on the repeal of IPAB, then we ought to be able to agree on the need to work together to secure Medicare's future, because it's fast approaching its expiration date. Without reform, the Medicare trustees have reported that Medicare will soon go broke and will not be able to provide the benefits so many seniors rely upon. With more than 10,000 baby boomers becoming eligible for benefits each day, it's critical that we all work together to ensure current and future beneficiaries have continued and uninterrupted access to much-needed care, and we must be accountable for those decisions. Rather than endangering Medicare beneficiaries, we should empower them. Rather than make decisions behind closed doors, we ought to have those decisions in public with patients and providers in our hearing rooms and walking the halls of Congress. We ought to consider the ideas of those affected. The Democrats got it right when they named the IPAB. It is truly the Independent Payment Advisory Board. It is independent from seniors, independent from people with disabilities, independent from voters, independent from legal challenges and appeals, and independent from any accountability, and that's why it must be repealed. And before I yield to the ranking member for any opening statement he wishes to make, I ask that all member opening statements be included in the record, and without objection, so ordered. Mr. Levin, you are recognized.
Thank you. We all know that Republicans have endeavored to repeal the Affordable Care Act in its entirety. Having failed at that, and with important and widely accepted provisions by the public having already become operational, Republicans have attempted to go after the law in piecemeal fashion. These efforts have not succeeded. This new effort will fail as well, with strong opposition, including that of the President of the United States. I urge, and I strongly urge, a no vote on this legislation, because health reform must be sustained, and if needed, improved and reformed, not repealed. Let's be clear. A Republican vote to repeal IPAB is not a vote to protect Medicare. Republicans voted to end the Medicare guarantee and instead turned seniors' health care coverage over to insurance companies. This would have shortened Medicare solvency, stripped the program of important fraud-fighting tools, increased beneficiary costs, and ended important delivery system reforms. We only need to look at the Affordable Care Act to see a true vision for protecting the Medicare program, a vision that results in lower beneficiary costs, that improves benefits, and that contains important instrumentalities for a reformed delivery system so that we encourage high-value health care rather than high-volume health care. According to nearly 300 economists, ACA puts into place essentially every cost containment provision policy analysts have considered. These measures, which include an array of tools above and beyond IPAB, are so effective that the CBO estimates that IPAB isn't going to be triggered until sometimes after 2021. CBO estimates that enacting H.R. 452, I quote, would not have any budgetary impact in 2012, but would increase direct spending by $3.1 billion over the 2013-2022 period, end of quotes, apparently mostly in the last years. There are ways to have a rational discussion about improvements or changes to IPAB, but this is an attempt to repeal IPAB as part and parcel of the main objective, to repeal health care reform. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 452. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Mr. Dan Elling, Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Health, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. And I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Elling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Section 1 of the amendment in the nature of a substitute contains the short title of the legislation, while Section 2 would repeal the IPAB statute while leaving in place subsection D, which provides for fast-track authority for its consideration in Congress.
All right, now we'll turn to questions. Mr. Herger is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll go down the line.
Yeah, I'll go back.
Mr. Elling, it's my understanding that the Independent Payment Advisory Board members are subject to Senate confirmation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
As we all know, the Senate has a backlog of nominations to consider, so it's a real possibility that we could be facing a scenario where IPAB doesn't have any members, but is required by law to submit its recommendations to Congress to cut Medicare spending. What would happen in this situation?
If the Senate failed to confirm members to serve on IPAB, they'd be left with two scenarios. One, the President would be able to appoint, through recess appointments, members to the board, thereby bypassing Senate confirmation. Or, if there were no members serving on IPAB, the Secretary of HHS, in years where spending exceeded the targets, would be required to cut Medicare so that the spending was in line with the predetermined targets.
And so under this scenario, the administration would develop the proposals to cut Medicare to meet the IPAB's targets, and unless Congress overrides these recommendations, they become law and administration would begin to implement these recommendations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. It seems to me that this is a truly unprecedented surrender of Congress's legislative authority under the Constitution. I hope we will have a strong bipartisan vote to repeal this undemocratic board. Mr. Ellis, Secretary Sebelius testified before the committee just last week and claimed that IPAB is prohibited from rationing care-altering benefits. However, it isn't difficult to envision a scenario where IPAB could achieve the same impact by slashing Medicare reimbursements for certain services and procedures to levels so low that few, if any, providers are willing to perform these services and procedures for the Medicare patients. That would achieve the same result as the IPAB directly cutting off beneficiaries' access to certain health care services and procedures. Is there anything in this law from preventing this from happening?
No, there's not. The term ration is not defined anywhere in the law, so it would be up to the IPAB members to decide what does or does not constitute rationing. Further, IPAB is tasked with cutting Medicare reimbursement rates to providers, and there's nothing to prevent the board from singling out certain procedures or services for more drastic cuts than others, which we've heard through testimony could indeed result in access issues for beneficiaries.
A last question, Mr. Elling. Some have suggested that IPAB was created to prevent outside lobbying from affecting decisions to cut Medicare. However, doesn't the statute say that IPAB, quote, may accept and dispose of gifts or donations of services or property?
Yes, sir, it does.
Thank you, Mr. Elling.
Mr. Starks recognized. Oh, did you want to be recognized? I'm sorry. Mr. Levin. Okay. Mr. Starks recognized for 5 minutes.
I guess I would just direct this question, if I might, to the chair. As we've heard, the CBO has suggested that at some point this plan would cost $3 billion and change. And how do you intend to pay for that, if I might be so impertinent as to ask?
Mr. Stark, as you know, that is not an appropriate item before a committee. That is required when we get to the floor. So before this legislation will go to the floor, there will have to be a proper pay for it. But at this time,
Sort of like Nixon saying when he'd end the war. so we're just,
and it did end.
we just have to wait and see, is that right?
We'll have to wait and see.
All right, thank you.
All right, Mr. Brady's recognized.
Well, like others, my mother's on Medicare, and I have no doubt that without repeal, that this unelected board of bureaucrats within the President's health care plan will eventually ration care for her and other seniors. She and other seniors are already facing $500 billion of cuts to some of their most important providers, local hospitals, nursing homes, home health care agencies, even hospice. The time you're dying and need that comfort, the new health care law cuts reimbursements and cuts access. Some 7 million seniors will be forced off their Medicare Advantage plan of choice already under this law. So this rationing board adds even more misery to those who need the most comfort. I think today this isn't a partisan issue. There are many Republicans and Democrats together who just believe that we ought not have an unelected board of bureaucrats accountable to no one, who make life and death decisions about denying care and treatment by refusing to reimburse fairly to our local providers to provide those treatments. And they'll deny that not because these treatments aren't medically necessary, but because it's gone over budget. that the aggregate costs of Medicare will exceed some target, and so these rationing decisions have to be made. And in the end, I believe it'll be the elderly who pay the price. It'll be the sick who pay the price. And it really is time to remove this terrible provision in the President's health care plan once and for all. I want to ask on the issue of rationing. We see today many of our local physicians who no longer can afford to see Medicare patients, would like to, but simply can't afford to. We've seen a series of proposed cuts that are devastating to our local physicians. That too occurs, not because Medicare or anyone else actually rations the care, they just deny reimbursement for those physicians. Does it work the same way under this IPAB group, that by denying reimbursements that they deny the access for our local providers to treat seniors in the future?
Providers have expressed a concern that because Medicare rates, particularly in the physician community, according to MedPAC, are about 20% below those in the private sector, that is resulting in physicians no longer accepting new Medicare beneficiaries or limiting the ones that they do accept. And so any further reductions to reimbursement would amplify that effect.
It just seems to me we already know the future. We're experiencing it today as more and more doctors are unable to see our seniors. That will just be expanded across more providers at a time when seniors need the care the most. Chairman, thank you for bringing this bill to this committee. I think we'll have a strong bipartisan vote in the end on this, and thank you for bringing it.
Thank you. Mr. Levin's recognized.
Don't count on that. Mr. Elling, I just want to say you were asked about the Senate, and they don't act on confirmations. That, like some of these other arguments, is so self-serving and I think hypocritical. I mean, the Senate nomination process has been blocked by the minority there. And so to say that the Senate may not act and to use that as an excuse to vote for this bill is a little hard to understand. You weren't asked that. The CBO has presented a cost estimate. Is that correct, Mr. Elling?
That's correct.
I ask that it be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Is it true, Mr. Elling, that they project that essentially that IPAB, in terms of its actions, won't be triggered until after 2021?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
So all this talk about rationing is really a scare tactic, in my judgment. Is it true that sometimes this committee has presented pay-fors for its legislation?
There currently aren't any pay-fors in the chairman's amendment to H.R. 450.
In previous bills, have there been pay-fors provided?
I defer to the chairman.
I think the answer is yes. Is it possible that some of the pay-fors would come from programs within the jurisdiction of this committee?
As I understand it, the pay-fors for this bill will be determined by members at a later date.
At a later date. I yield back.
Dr. Bustani is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elling, as a physician with a lot of clinical experience, over 20 years of clinical experience, I've been very cognizant of the importance of the doctor-patient relationship and how it relates to access to care and high-quality care. And I have deep concerns about IPAB as the statute's written and how it will be implemented. And, in dealing with insurance companies for many, many years, when, let's say, a patient who had a coronary blockage was denied care. I know how difficult it is to deal with individual insurance companies and having to fight for patients. What kind of recourse would a beneficiary or a physician have if IPAB was believed to be in error by a physician or groups of physicians?
There'd be very little, if any, recourse because the judicial review process is waived for IPAB.
And is it in fact true that since the statute prohibits anyone from employment of any kind to be a member of this IPAB board, that clinicians actively engaged in the practice of medicine who understand the clinical implications, the latest research, the latest developments in care would be precluded from serving on the IPAB board?
That's correct.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Kynes recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elling, I'm trying to recall, maybe you know the answer, but at the time the Affordable Care Act was passed, the Congressional Budget Office did an analysis of the IPAB and determined that it could result in cost savings of roughly $15 billion at the time of passage. Is that right?
That's correct.
But the IPAB is only triggered if there's certain targeted growth rates are exceeded. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the Congressional Budget Office, in the recent analysis of IPAB and the effects that the ACAs already have on cost containment, has determined that now IPAB could result in roughly $3 billion in costs?
CBO's current baseline does not assume that the IPAB will be instructed to enact cuts.
Well, right now, I think, given current spending projections, IPAB may be triggered by about 2022, according to CBO. Is that right?
They do not expect the cuts to be triggered within the next 10-year window.
Right. But nevertheless, there is a CBO cost of this repeal legislation of roughly $3 billion.
Yes,
is that
sir.
right? Mr. Chairman, may I ask, has there been any discussions on your side about possible offsets to pay for this $3 billion cost for the legislation?
Well, of course, there's always discussions, but we don't have anything finalized at this time. But obviously, before we go to the floor, we will. And I would just say that that is not in the bill, and so Mr. Elling's not going to be able to really respond to questions.
I'm not
about
expecting
the
you. That's why I asked you the question.
Yeah.
But I would hope that you would engage our side, too, as far as possible offsets that your side might be considering before the legislation is brought up, so we might have some input as well.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Mr. Elling, also to clarify, now, even if the targeted growth rates trigger IPAB's action to submit a recommendation to Congress for spending reductions, Congress still has the ability to intervene and come up with our own spending reductions if we don't agree with the IPAB recommendation. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So IPAB really is a mechanism forcing congressional action if healthcare costs exceed specific targets. Is that right?
That's correct.
So there's nothing prohibiting future Congresses from being able to work together and come up with our own spending reductions with healthcare costs if we disagree with what IPAB might be recommending to us. Is that right?
Correct.
But if the Congress isn't able to agree on finding some alternative offsets in that, what IPAB recommends would take effect then. Is that right?
Yes, or if the president vetoed whatever Congress had passed.
Right. It just seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that this is a fail-safe mechanism, something that may not even be triggered because of the effects the Affordable Care Act is already having in constraining health care costs. But even if it is triggered, there's going to be a panel of experts from doctors to patients to consumers to health advocates serving on this commission looking at what's driving these costs, submitting a recommendation to Congress of what they would recommend to restrain these rising costs, but still allowing the Congress to do our own thing. But it does force the Congress to take action on the largest and fastest growing area of spending with the federal budget, which is rising health care costs. And if history is any guide, past Congresses have not been very good at doing that. And that's why IPAB, I think, is a crucial tool or an instrument as we move forward in the future to try to restrain and control rising health care costs, but without shutting us out of the process. We still have the ability to intervene, to make our own recommendations and take action if we happen to disagree with the IPAB panel. Now, Mr. Elling, finally, Isn't it correct that by law, IPAB is specifically prohibited from making recommendations that ration health care?
There is that provision in the law, yes, sir, but there's no definition as to what
And
constitutes.
isn't IPAB also legally forbidden from modifying Medicare premiums or cost sharing for seniors?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Elling. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following on Mr. Kine's questioning, IPAB is there to help us control costs, is it not?
To control spending, yes, sir.
Control spending, not costs. So people can submit whatever they want, but it's the question of how much the federal government's going to pay. Is that right?
Yes.
So in effect, what we're saying here is we don't want any control on federal spending done by anybody except members of Congress who sit on this committee. Is that correct?
The underlying bill would repeal IPAB.
So it would make all the responsibility on this committee to control the cost of spending in entitlement programs, including Medicare. Is that correct?
This committee and others, yes.
This committee and others. Who else raises money in this Congress?
The Energy and Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over the Medicare program, and the Senate Finance Committee as well.
Do they raise money?
In terms of revenue,
Yes. That's what revenue is money.
the Finance Committee.
They raise the money over there in the Energy and Commerce Committee?
No, sir.
So this committee is saying, we're going to stand up, as no one has ever done before, and make cuts in the program or control costs in the program. Let's not call it cuts, that's a bad word. But we're going to control costs in the program. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, the costs can only go certain places, right? The cuts can only go, or the reductions can only go certain places. You either take away services, right? Or you take away revenue that's given to providers, or you ask the recipients to pick up more of the costs. Is that correct?
Those are some options, yes, sir.
You think of another one?
I would just say to the
Oh, wait a minute,
gentleman,
I'm
I would
asking
just say to the gentleman, we do need to stay focused on what is before the committee and the legislation before the committee. Mr. Elling really is only qualified to talk about this legislation.
I understand that you want to protect them, and I'll make my statement because
I want
the
to
fact
keep us
is,
focused on the task at hand.
the fact is, this committee and the Congress and the Senate voted to put IPAB in there because they are not able to do this. They are unwilling to stand up to the medical industrial complex and say this much and no more. Now, Mr. Ryan took one method. He said, let's shift the cost over onto the recipients, the seniors. Let's give them all a voucher, whatever, $5,800, $9,000, whatever, and go out and find your own insurance. And anything it doesn't pay for, it's on you. That's one solution. Our solution, the IPAD, is one that says, let's look at these costs and figure out how we can cut them. And if we fail, there will be a backup that will step in and do it. And then if they make a proposal, we can change it. That's correct, isn't it? If they make a proposal, the Congress can change it.
That's correct.
So we are not giving up one single bit of our own power. We just don't want any outside board to make any suggestions to us. Is that correct? That's the effect of removing this, right?
Yes.
I mean, we wouldn't have anybody else except lobbyists to come in and tell us what should and should not happen, right?
I don't think that warrants a response, frankly.
Well, the
Because
fact is,
there
Mr.
are many
Chairman,
organizations, Mr. McDermott, MedPAC and others that advise this committee in an official way, CMS, on policy with regard to Medicare and other health care issues.
Do we always follow MedPAC, Mr. Chairman? See, we change everything. And this is one where we like to change things up, but we do not like to change things down. And that's the real problem here is that if we, and I was sitting talking to Mr. Reed. When I sat where Mr. Reed was a long time ago, I thought, well, I'll never be here. There'll be about 5 members of this committee here in 2012 by the estimates of the way things have gone over here. I yield back to
Thank you. I would just also point out that MedPAC is advisory in nature. Mr. T-Berry's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Elling. I read a letter, or part of a letter, from a physician in my district who I'd never met before that was sent to the president and sent to me. And that letter was informing the president and informing me that she was now in a position of no longer being able to afford to see Medicare patients. She also expressed in my follow-up phone call to her that the Affordable Care Act, while well-intended, was actually going to make it more difficult for her as a patient, as a physician seeing Medicare patients. And one of the concerns that she expressed to me, Mr. Chairman, was this board. And for the life of me, I don't understand why we as members of Congress aren't listening more to healthcare professionals' concern about this board. Mr. Elling, is there anything in the legislation that initially passed that this piece of legislation in front of seeks to repeal? Is there anything that prevents this unelected board to propose rationing of health care or government reimbursements to physicians?
No, sir.
So this unelected, unaccountable board, which I understand according to the legislation that initially passed, actually doesn't even have to meet in public, can meet behind closed doors and determine how physicians practice. This entity, paid with, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, dollars coming out of the trust fund, is that correct?
That's correct.
Can actually impact a physician's role with a patient if it is allowed to go into effect.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for putting this legislation up today. This is about the future of Medicare. I've sat here in this seat, talked about my mom and dad and the importance of Medicare to them. My mom has experienced what that doctor wrote to the president, physicians saying, no more, go to some other doctor, I'm not going to take Medicare. And from doctors that I've spoken to, unless we start doing things like we're doing today, we're going to see more physicians across our country tell Medicare patients, I'm sorry, can't do it anymore. I urge support of the underlying bill. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Sir, can you tell us, as Staff Director of the Subcommittee on Health, the Ways and Means Committee, what is the urgency for the consideration of this piece of legislation today?
Yeah. I think that's outside the scope of his
Well, Mr. Chairman, maybe you can tell us. What is the urgency? Is this a deliberate, systematic attempt to destroy, to get rid of the Affordable Care Act? Is this just another step down a very long road?
Well, I would just say to the gentleman that I think that many of us believe it is urgent to repeal this unelected board who will get between seniors and their doctors.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it doesn't go
the
into
bill,
effect.
the
until
bill has been out there for some time, so the health care bill has been passed for some time, so I think it's time that we begin to address some of the concerns with it. That's why we're doing this today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Mr. Neal's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I think Mr. Lewis has suggested, and that is that this really is, in the end, a strategy to undo the Affordable Care Act and to hobble it as it goes forward. Now, when I heard some of our Republican friends this morning speaking of their concerns, this unparalleled assault on congressional responsibility, the same people who rush to the well of the House and offer balanced budget amendments to the Constitution, the same people who embrace the line item veto for the president, the same people who think it's impermissible for members of Congress to have any say over a transportation bill in terms of members' districts. And you can see where this argument is gone. The idea here is to fundamentally change the Affordable Health Care Act, but at the same time provide more authority for future administrations, be they Democrat or Republicans, to decide what Congress, in Article 1 of the Constitution, is required to decide. There is a reason that Congress is mentioned as the first branch of the government in Article 1 for our constitutional friends. So we go through this extraordinary strain on spending, where taxes are cut by $2.3 trillion and 2 sovereign nations are invaded. And same members who voted for all of it rush to the well of the House and say, well, if we only had a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, we'd be in great shape. Or falling over themselves to hand the president, any president, the line item veto. And then, subsequently, the argument about Medicare, a party that has tried to undo Medicare since Mr. Johnson offered it in 1965. This is how these arguments have become changed and strained here on Capitol Hill. Let's have a discussion about outsourcing congressional authority as it relates to IPAB. But let's also have some sense of intellectual honesty on the other items that I've just mentioned. Run the country into debt and then bring forward a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution? Turn authority for spending over to the President of the United States, again, any president? Congress has been willing and ready to give up its authority for years now, and never to choose the fight. And that's why we find ourselves where we are on this very piece of tenuous legislation this morning.
Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elling, as the staff director for the Subcommittee on Health, you're very familiar with the Affordable Care Act and the health reform legislation, and obviously then this bill which would repeal that portion of the health reform that deals with the Independent Payment Advisory Board, correct?
Yes, sir.
And this bill before us, which calls for the repeal of that board, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, is very direct. It's a short piece of legislation. It calls for the repeal, the elimination of the IPAB, correct?
Correct.
It's very specific in its repeal. We've been told by the Congressional Budget Office that to repeal the IPAB, to eliminate this board, will cost the federal government $3 billion over the next 10 years. We heard the chairman earlier tell us that the Republicans have not yet finalized the provisions that they'll put in place to help cover the cost of those $3 billion. So at this stage, we're in the dark as to what will be done to offset the costs that will be incurred by passing this legislation to eliminate the IPAB. Does the legislation provide anything in it to protect seniors on Medicare from suffering cuts to their benefits to cover the cost of this elimination?
There are currently no offsets in the legislation.
Okay, so but I'm not asking if there are offsets. I'm asking you if there's language in this legislation that would protect a senior who is on Medicare from suffering a benefit cut in order to pay for this legislation.
The chairman's amendment would strike IPAB, and that's
Yes, I understand that, but you're not answering my question. And I could pull out the legislation and read it to you because it's very short. I'm asking you, as the staff director, as counsel who's supposed to guide us, is there language in this legislation that would protect a senior on Medicare from having his or her benefits cut to offset the cost of repealing this board?
Sir, there are no offsets in the underlying bill.
Yeah, you've said that 3 times, Mr. Elling. I understand that there are no offsets. I'm asking you if there is language in the legislation that protects a senior from having his or her benefits cut in order to protect them against any offsets which have not been identified.
Will the gentleman
Yeah,
yield?
Mr. Becerra, if I might be able to help, this legislation today is only to repeal the IPAB.
Mr. Chairman, I fully understand that. I fully understand that the purpose of this legislation is to repeal the IPAB.
and before it
But I'm
goes-
simply asking, if it's solely for the purpose of repealing the legislation, then I believe the answer that Mr. Elling is not giving is that there is no language in the legislation that would protect a senior from having to suffer the consequences of having benefits cut in order to pay for the $3 billion cost of repealing this legislation. That doesn't mean benefits will be cut, but there's nothing to guarantee a senior that this legislation won't ultimately result in a beneficiary, a senior, facing cuts to his or her benefits to cover the $3 billion cost of eliminating this board. And Mr. Elliott, I'll ask you one more time, because I think it is within your province or your jurisdiction as the council to guide us on what the purpose of this legislation is, or at least what the legislation says. If you could just tell me, does this legislation say that in eliminating the IPAB, there are also provisions in this legislation that would say that we are protecting seniors from any cuts to their benefits under Medicare?
This legislation stops with the repeal of IPAB.
Okay, so
It would
I don't
require a
think I'm
vote
gonna-
of Congress to change any, if IPAB is repealed, it would require a vote of Congress to change any benefits of Medicare beneficiaries.
That's correct.
That-
Mr. Chairman,
so
I fully
a
understand that.
separate
That
vote
means,
of
of course, Mr. Chairman, that if the Congress were to try to do that, we would have to make sure we try to stop that. And I would think that this legislation, if it's trying to repeal the IPAB, and it's going to cost us, as we know, $3 billion, and as the chairman has said, we're going to have to come up with $3 billion in offsets that we would want to protect seniors from being cut in their benefits as you are moving forward to try to eliminate this program, which saves us those $3 billion. So I simply was trying to get a straight answer. I apologize, Mr. Elling, that I posed to you a very difficult question for you to answer with regard to what the legislation says. But I think the answer has become clear from what you have said and from what the chairman has said, that there is nothing in this legislation that would protect a senior from facing cuts to his or her benefits in order to compensate for the cuts that have to be made to the tune of $3 billion to cover the cost of this legislation. I yield back.
Yeah, and any offset would have to be voted on by the Congress. Mr. Dawkins is recognized for 5 minutes.
And of course, there are no offsets in this bill, and I think it really, it's clear the answer is that the bill itself contains no protection from seniors against cuts. That's the question that the gentleman really declines to answer. And I think this entire debate reflects a difference in the analysis. It's a fair difference to have between Republicans and Democrats about what's wrong with Medicare. The Republicans think that seniors pay so little, and they have a voucher plan that they have outlined in detail that will have the effect of seniors paying so much more. They would tell seniors to go fish with the government voucher, find some insurance company, like the handful of insurance companies that couldn't handle this when Medicare was set up in the first place. That's why we have a Medicare system. Go out and find an insurance company and bear a little more of the cost of health care every year under the Republican approach. A number of us in the Affordable Care Act focused on the other end of the equation, that it costs so much more, that health care costs were rising much more rapidly than the cost of living generally, and that we needed not only to make health care more accessible, but we needed to make it more affordable by addressing spending and cost. Now, I have often wished, as I've had people yell about whether you read the bill that you wrote and the like, that the detractors, that the cynics about this affordable health care bill who say it's so bad. I wish the Affordable Health Care Act was as good as they think it is bad. It's not. Like this particular provision, it's flawed. It is the result of taking what was in essence a Republican bill from a number of sessions back and changing it and then going through the legislative process with compromise on top of compromise. And even after we thought we had a fully developed bill here in the House, seeing the Senate make significant changes in it, and then frankly seeing the administration make some changes that weaken certain aspects of the bill. But it seems to me that on the whole, that if you put this bill up against, and you put this whole Affordable Care Act with this provision up against the system that we had, that this is far superior. We have specific provisions that prohibit rationing, prohibit increasing premiums, and prohibit cutting benefits. And if we do not address the cost issue, as this bill attempts to do, then we're going to see the cost shifted to the seniors, and we will go with the Republican approach of pay more instead of trying to cost less. We do have responsibility in this committee to deal with health care costs, and I've served on the committee for a number of years. And what happens when this advisory committee comes out is that there is a significant amount of political arm twisting, political muscle, log rolling, and when you really look at how well this committee has done its job in controlling health care costs, you only need to look at the numbers. There have been some successes. They have been painful successes politically. One of the major successes where this committee really overcame a lot of political opposition to do the right thing was the Affordable Health Care Act. About $500 billion in savings plowed back into Medicare, and we paid something of a political price for doing that. The notion in this year, with the standing of Congress where it is now, that there's something wrong about bringing in some independent experts to serve as a board to deal with this problem instead of leaving it all to the political process of Congress, I find difficult to understand or to defend. It may well be that the Independent Advisory Board, Payment Advisory Board, needs to be changed in the future. But the approach that is being taken here today is just like the approach that was taken on Long-Term Health Care Act here a few weeks ago. It's the same approach the Republicans took when they repealed the entire Affordable Health Care Act and substituted a page and a half of 12 platitudes. And now we have gone a year and almost a quarter, and you have failed to come forward with any legislation on the replace part of this bill. You've controlled the House. You could have provided a replacement to these approaches. All we've had is complete repeal and then little bitsy appeal going through the various sections of the bill. In a way, our Republican colleagues have provided a very backhanded endorsement of the Affordable Health Care Act. They say they don't like it. They tell us everything that's wrong about it, but they sure can't come up with a better idea that they have the courage to bring out here and present for a markup. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Roscoe's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Elling, let's shift gears. You up for that? Secretary Sebelius testified, as you know, before the committee not long ago, and she said that there is a prohibition in the Act under current law from rationing. I asked the question of one of the panels of experts earlier this week about that whole notion of rationing, and it's sort of in the eyes of the beholder. Let me ask you this. Well, the Secretary and the proponents of the bill say that rationing is an impossibility. Just relax, no problem. Rationing can't happen, won't happen. We specifically cite it in the Affordable Care Act. You can't ration. Just trust us. Isn't it a fact that under IPAB, the unelected bureaucrats could say, we're not rationing, we're just not going to pay for it. So, off with you, be lively, choose your health care, but we're just not going to pay for it. Now, isn't that in net effect rationing per se? Wouldn't you say that?
Yes, sir.
I yield back.
They could only speak to what's in the bill.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't like IPAD. I don't like the concept of farming out
our responsibility and our job to anybody, the president, an outside board, or anybody else. But as has been pointed out, the problem that we're trying to deal with is we haven't done our job as a Congress. And I think that's a bigger problem than everything else. My concern is that instead of doing our job, we're using this bill to undermine the Accountable Care Act. And I understand that the Accountable Care Act was done without any participation from the other side of the aisle, and I think that's one of the problems with the bill. It would have been a much better work product had we all worked together to try and deal with this vexing issue of health care, but it quickly became a partisan issue, and it took on a political bent, and I think we all suffer from that. But the fact of the matter is, the Accountable Care Act's working. In my home state, 300,000 Californians saved over $170 million on their prescription drug costs. 3 million Medicare beneficiaries and 6 million private folks covered by private insurance now have access to preventive health care. There's 12 million Californians who won't run up against the lifetime cap on their insurance, and over 350,000 young people are able to stay on their parents' insurance policy. And that's all good stuff. We've got more community health care centers now because of the funding we provided, so more people have access to health care, and we have a healthier community. And that's important. And the idea that we would pick apart the Accountable Care Act, starting with the action we took the other day on the long-term health care bill, and now today the IPAB, I find very, very troubling, as I'm sure that all of our constituents would. I think that the Accountable Care Act's working. I think we need to do a lot of refinement to it. We need to continue to work on it. Anybody who doesn't recognize that once we pass a bill here on anything, it's not the end of the issue. We don't solve problems, we address problems here, and we need to continue to do that. And that's what we should be spending our time on, not trying to kill the Accountable Care Act by a death by 1,000 cuts, and especially this cut that is totally irresponsible from a fiscal perspective. This is a $3 billion hit. It's not paid for, and it just rubs salt into the wound. We shouldn't go there. And as much as I believe we should be dealing with this as part of our job, as much as I dislike the concept of farming out our job, I'm going to vote against this bill for those reasons, and I encourage everybody else to do the same.
Mr. Reichert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a list of organizations supporting IPAB repeal, which number over 360.
Without objection.
There's also a letter attached, too, that I'd like to have unanimous consent accepted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Well, first, I want to agree with a couple of my colleagues on the panel this morning. First of all, I share Mr. Kine's frustration in not being a part of a process, and I think that people across this country know that the process in which this Affordable Care Act was put into law was a process which left our side of the aisle totally out of the process of having any input at all. Thus, a large portion of our population across the United States not having a voice to apply any ideas or thoughts that they might want to have included in this bill. So, secondly, I'd also like to express my agreement with the ranking member in that I think there is an effort on this side of the aisle to address some of the grave concerns and language that's included in this bill. And this week we had a hearing on the Healthcare Subcommittee regarding IPAB, and I listed some of the other issues that we've struggled with, and some of the Democrats have also agreed that these other issues are problems within the law. For example, the 1099 requirement that was placed upon employers that have been removed from the Affordable Health Care Act. the Class Act, which we now learn we can't pay for. There are now currently 2 lawsuits that, or more than 2 lawsuits that are directed specifically at Americans' ability to make choices in their health care, mandatory requirements to buy health care, and then also some religious concerns that have risen over the last few weeks. We've also learned during this process that although there's been a promise that you can keep your health care if you like it, guess what? America, you can't. You can't keep your health care if you like your health care plan. You won't be able to keep it under the Affordable Health Care Act. So the other thing now that we learned is that under IPAB, further choices are removed, and access for seniors will be restricted. Whether you call it rationing or limited access, reduced coverage, or benefits, it's going to happen under IPAB, and seniors will have less control over their quality and health care access. So my question will go to the trigger that determines IPAB. They must make these decisions based on cost cutting, and that's tied to the growth in Medicare expenditures. And IPAB recommendations will have to take the form of reduced Medicare payments to providers. This is a bad deal for Medicare beneficiaries, as slashing payments means less access to providers. I understand there is a group of patients beyond our seniors, though, and people with disabilities that could also see access to providers diminished. And this would be our nation's active duty military, retirees, and their families. Since TRICARE payments rates to providers are tied to Medicare payment rates, is it possible that IPAB recommendations will harm access to care for the valiant members of our military and their families?
You're right, sir, because TRICARE reimbursements are pegged to Medicare reimbursements. Any reduction to Medicare rates would have a similar effect in TRICARE.
On our military. Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield just a few moments to Dr. Vastani.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman. I want to respond to Ranking Member Lewis's question about the urgency. The urgency is this. We have not solved the reimbursement issue, and as long as reimbursements do not meet cost, we're going to have problems with access, period. And that problem is accelerating. It's getting worse. And not only that, we're seeing fewer people going to medical school, even fewer selecting certain residency programs, and early retirements. We're going to have a significant physician shortage. That's the urgency. And the specter of IPAB is one of the major factors, along with the issues I expressed about reimbursement, that are causing this problem. If we don't address this, we're going to have a major disruption in access to health care. Thank you.
All right, time's expired. Mr. Blumenauer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The assertion was made by my good friend from Texas that this IPAP represents an unprecedented abrogation of congressional authority. Has not Congress established in trade legislation a fast track that has similar limitations in terms of procedure and how it proceeds? Isn't that a restriction?
I'm sorry, sir, I'm not familiar with...
Fast track? You're not familiar with fast track legislation?
Not in other areas, no.
If I might be helpful, I can tell you that nothing in fast track becomes law without a vote of Congress.
I'm talking about how Congress procedurally handles things.
Mr. Blumenauer.
If Congress does not act under IPAB, I'm just trying to be helpful to your question, and I'll give you some time, extra time, but if Congress does not act under IPAB, there is a path in IPAB for the recommendations of IPAB to become law. There is nothing in fast track that allows whatever is negotiated by the administration to become law without a vote of the Congress. So I was just trying to clarify.
I understand your distinction, if I may reclaim my time.
Yes.
The fact is that Congress here and with legislation dealing with base closings, where they were just things that had individual log rolling and a failure of Congress, that we went ahead and made some changes to how we operate. And as several of my colleagues have mentioned, and the reason that the SGR was imposed was because Congress blinks. Congress wants it both ways. It wants to save money, but it wants to give more and more benefits and not deal with the indications of how cost control takes place. The IPAP, when it was originally established, was going to represented a cost saving of $15 billion. Do I have that correct?
Yes, sir.
And now it's $3 billion, but the $3 billion is outside the 10-year window?
CBO's current baseline projects zero savings, but the cost of this legislation is $3 billion within the 10-year window.
But that is not what's shown in terms of the act. I want to go back at some point, look at this, because actually this is not going to be triggered in the 10 years. Because, as has been mentioned, the Affordable Care Act is actually working. I mean, it's hard for some people to accept, but I appreciate what my friend from California pointed out in terms of the changes that we're seeing already. Now, a doctor from Ohio may be worried about what might happen in 10 years, but in terms of IPAP, but the fact is the Affordable Care Act, in terms of protecting coverage, expanding enrollment, and even Medicare Advantage, I find it ironic my friends are talking about how somehow this is slashing. Medicare Advantage enrollment is increasing. And it's interesting to note, those of you who are on the Budget Committee know that the Republican budget kept the $500 billion that Republican candidates campaigned against because those were reforms in the system, and you kept them. You didn't reverse them, you kept them. Your budget is predicated on that same $500 billion. Now, I am intrigued with people here, instead of looking at how the system is working now and working together to accelerate what used to be bipartisan reforms, like the mandate, and other things that are pilot projects that have been experimented in states that have Republican and Democratic governors. Instead of working to accelerate it, you're fixating on a worst-case scenario 10 years from now if Congress fails, predicated on the notion that the Republican Senate will continue to be dysfunctional and not allow routine appointments to boards and commissions, that this board would violate the plain language of the law, and most important, that Congress will continue to fail to do its job in a responsible way to contain costs. That's the only way this happens, is if you have a breakdown in the Senate, if Congress doesn't act, and if the progress that you are seeing in your state and I'm seeing in mine falls apart. I would be embarrassed to be fixated on this rather than working to make sure that we deal with real healthcare problems that face America still. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would just say, you mentioned BRAC, that if Congress rejects BRAC, there's no requirement that Congress close an equal number of bases somewhere else. However, with IPAB, if Congress disapproves of those recommendations, Congress would be forced to find an equal number of Medicare cuts somewhere else, or the IPAB recommendations would become law. So that's the unprecedented nature of it.
I think that would be a good addition to BRAC.
All right. Well,
that we
okay.
don't, that if we're going to play games with BRAC and not deal responsibly, that then we have to step up and do our job. I'd vote for that in a heartbeat, and I think some of you would too.
All right, I understand there are no further questions. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, before we do that, I'd like unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter from 300 economists opposing this repeal.
Without objection. Mr. Herger.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 452 to the House of Representatives
As amended.
as amended.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.